Heidi Meyer, thank you so much for coming on the show. Really appreciate your time.
Oh, thanks. Thanks for having me, Ro.
Now you've worked in Afghanistan for many years in various capacities, various senior capacities. But before we get into them, let's do a personal background of what led you to end up in Kabul.
So actually, my time working on Afghanistan issues and policies and um, programs was about 10 years, period of 10 years. And it started with NATO in Mons at the military headquarters. Very soon after the NATO deployment into Afghanistan, the ISAF mission, stabilization mission. So it started um, very early on, probably around 2002. And then for 10 years, I worked in different elements of the international effort in Afghanistan. And I finally um, departed uh, my my ties with Afghanistan around 2013. So it was a period of, I would say, 10 years, of which 5 years I spent in country. And it was during, really started at the beginning of the NATO mission, the ISAF mission in Afghanistan, went through all of Barack Obama's surge, General Petraeus's surge, and then finished very close to the end of the ISAF mission. So I think my knowledge really is really has a lot to do with what happened during that NATO mission and international presence in Afghanistan.
Your first trip to Afghanistan was working for the Pentagon. What was that role and what did it entail?
So I had done about 3 years working in SHAPE in Mons, supporting the Americans who deployed to Kabul in the early days of the ISAF mission. And then finally, I thought, wow, I would much rather be in Kabul than here working on it in Mons, Belgium. And so I secured a position, defense position in Kabul, as a strategic advisor in the palace in Kabul. And it really was, there was a small group of international advisors who were helping the Afghan government to stand up a National Security Council, just to help give them some structure and input on and capability building on how you create a national security structure. How do you create a strategy, a long-term security strategy? How do you link that to national budgets? And we were this small team of UN, NATO, American, and representatives who worked with the National Security Council staff in the palace.
And it was Karzai's palace, right?
It was Karzai, yes.
How did you find, arriving in Afghanistan and, falling into the thick of it about the city, about the people, about the environment, and then, falling into Karzai's palace?
So I remember, the first day driving from the airport and looking around, and it was just so incredibly exciting to see this very different country than we're used to in the Western world. Um, People going about their business, running little market stalls and selling items on the side of the road, busy, industrious, getting on with their lives, and then driving along that main drag that goes from the Kabul airport all the way to the area. I guess we'd call it a green zone. It wasn't technically called a green zone, but it was an area where the international community operated from, and going into the secure area, and just incredibly exciting to be part of this great effort to, improve security and improve the future prospects of such a beautiful country. It was very exciting to be there.
But, setting up, the National Security Council, it is such an important organ in any power place in, modern power place in the world. The National Security Advisor being one of the key principles in any government. but Afghanistan was entirely new to the whole idea, new to the concept. But
Hmm.
how was it to instilling that institution into the decision-making processes of the Afghan government, bearing in mind that most of these men in charge had either had a war, conflict, civil war background, or either worked for people or were some way, I suppose, owed their positions to those people. And I'm kind of curious to see how the clash of two cultures would have worked.
Well, you're absolutely right to comment on that, and I'm not sure that it did work actually. Let's be really honest about it. I mean, I think speaking candidly, and remember, these are obviously my own opinions. They're not. These are my observations and my views and opinions. And I think looking back on it now, we all thought this little team of internationals all thought we were all frightfully clever going to the Karzai Palace every day and advising a National Security Council. The reality was that I think if I was really honest, I think they tolerated us. For us to be arrogant enough to say we made a difference, I'm not sure we made any difference because you're absolutely right. They knew the power dynamics of what was going on in Afghanistan in a way that we never could understand that. And I think in many ways they paid like in many things. It wasn't just the National Security Council. A lot of the ministries, I think they paid lip service and they tolerated us because they knew far better than us the political dynamics that were going on. I mean, if you were going to be very simplistic about it, you could say, well, setting up a National Security Council with international advice, maybe it was just simply about setting up the structure. How do you make it work on a day-to-day basis? And as I said earlier, if you have a big picture national security strategy for the country, that has to be linked to all the work that the various ministries are doing, the Ministry of Justice, the 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 ministry that ran the police, the Ministry of Interior that ran the police, the Ministry of Tribal Affairs, the Ministry of NDLG, I mean, local governance, they all had to have a say in that national security overarching strategy. And to be able to make it work, each ministry would have to be allocated a budget that they could then spend on making a national security strategy work. So that's sort of the general idea, but the difficulty of trying to achieve that in just a few years, I think it would take years to be able to do that. And we had this aspiration that we were going to be able to achieve it, you know, certainly after Barack Obama, we were going to be able to achieve that by 2014. That's not achievable to put that sort of structure and that sort of training in place to a country that's emerged out of civil war and then the Taliban in power, which had no sort of structure like that. So it's a really grandiose objective with really very unrealistic um, aspirations, frankly.
Talk about the culture shock of entering, the palace, which has not been kind to people who'd occupied it over its history. I mean, I always say Afghanistan since 1902 has had 14 rulers. Only one, only two, I think, managed to survive their ruling time with their heads intact,
Mm,
at least while being in office. Others have either been exiled through a coup or been, killed whilst
mm.
ruling. So, it's just a sense of history that there is about that place, and the man that was holding the power there, or was he not?
Karzai at the time when I was there, yeah. Well, so I would walk out from the American um, base that was really well secured, and I would walk out of the gate every morning with my Arg Palace pass around my neck. I was one of very, very few groups of very few handful of internationals that had this very coveted pass that you could
Ah,
actually walk into the Arg Palace, and it was rather a unnerving experience every day. I'd walk out from the military base. I'd walk, I think it was about 10 or 15 minutes to walk to the Ark Palace. And as you get closer to it, it becomes very grand with grand roads with lovely plantings along the side. And you've got this feeling that you were leaving an international world and really walking into the world of Afghanistan. And you arrive at the gates of the palace, and the first thing that happens is that you are taken into a side area where there are only female Afghan National Police who are going to search you and make sure that you're not carrying anything dangerous or suspicious. And this happened every single morning. And what was really amusing to me is that I would have one bag with papers in it, maybe some water, something like that. I mean, really innocuous things. And every single morning, these women, who I knew most of them after I'd been there about a year, they would unpack my bag completely and look through absolutely everything. And sometimes I would have, makeup in there, maybe a lipstick, maybe some hand cream. And every morning they would take those items and try them out. They'd try on the lipstick, they'd try on the hand cream, and then they would look at me as if to say, well, we're not going to take this from you, but we would really like these items. And then I would say, yes, you can have them, and they would take them and it would make them so happy. And then, after my bag had been cleared out and repacked, then I would make my way closer to the
with
to the
pretty
palace.
items taken.
Yeah.
But I suppose it
But
kind of tells you something about the culture as well. And also, the I know about those women's sense of place and their sense of self, maybe.
they were remarkable women. I mean, they had a job to do and they took it very, very seriously. And I think they were very proud of the fact that they must have been in their 20s and 30s, so they were clearly children during the time of the Taliban, and now they were living in this different world where the international community had arrived, and they were given an opportunity to have a job where you actually had status, where you were important. You had to search people coming into the palace. I mean, it was what a novel experience for them. It's remarkable. Now, whether they got paid or not on time is another story, another question, because of course the payment of the Afghan National Police is one of the huge problems that is responsible for the undermining and deterioration of the police.
Despite all the achievements, government spaces didn't become a safe space for women to working in those environments either.
Yeah, I always, because I worked at the national, was working as a capacity builder in the National Security Council, which in a way is ironic and rather arrogant as an international. That little me telling these men who had survived, a civil war and the trials and tribulations of a Taliban government and now a new government. It's always amazing to me to think that yes, the international community would be so presumptuous to think that we could tell them anything. But
Mm.
anyway, that aside. And because of that particular job, and I said earlier about working with different ministries to tie in a grand national strategy with what was on in each ministry, I actually spent a lot of time going to all the ministries in Kabul. And I was always astonished to see the number of women who were working there. I mean, they weren't just in positions of, making the tea, although they did do that for everyone. They were sitting at desks, they were working, they were answering telephones, they were um, going to meetings. They were very much part of the buzz that
Mm.
was going on in these ministries. And I always used to think they seem to take to it so naturally. they're there. They don't seem to be held back
Mm.
by the fact that women have a different status in Afghanistan. They're definitely there on the front line. They have a voice. And it was
Yeah.
a really good thing to see.
And how was the palace like? The Karzais in a harem, could we say?
Well, I got to be careful how much I disclose there, obviously. But, um, well, the National Security Director at the time was Dr. Zelmay Rasool, who
Yes.
was an extremely nice, mild-mannered man. Um, and I
Until
never saw him
recently, the
upset.
the
I never saw
ambassador
him.
in London.
Subsequently,
Yes. Yeah.
you mean after that role as National Security Advisor?
No, I mean until recently, because he was the last ambassador of the Republic in London.
Ah, well, I didn't know that.
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
I
yeah,
obviously
yeah.
dipped out of Afghanistan business in 2013 and took up Ukrainian business. So I didn't know that, but I'm really happy to hear that. I
Yeah,
mean,
yeah, yeah.
I'm sure he was a great ambassador. I mean, he's an extremely gracious man,
Hmm.
very mild-mannered. And we saw him from time to time, but we were generally working with his staff. Um, and they were young Afghans connected to the palace, connected to Karzai. They were personal relationships that were going on. So we heard a lot of the comings and goings of the palace and what was going on in the palace and what was happening and whether the president was traveling and what he was doing. And yeah, I think it was inevitable that we would have an ear to what was going on.
Places of power always have an element of 30% work, 70% gossip. So
Yeah. Yeah, no, I think we were all I think there was six of us advisors, and we all felt extraordinarily privileged that we saw what was going on at the very heart of politics in Afghanistan, and that we were certainly on the periphery,
mm,
absolutely for sure, but still we got a view into what was happening, and it was a great way to experience Afghan Afghan way of life rather than just an international way of life.
at that time, the relationship between Karzai and the allies in the West were progressively were getting worse and worse, and he was getting more and more paranoid about what the Americans in particular were up to. So, how were those kind of things impacting both your presence and the impact that they were having on your work?
Well, it did impact the work because, I mean, clearly we were there to work on process. We weren't there to be involved in the politics at all. We were simply there for structure and the process of running a National Security Council. That was it. But it was inevitable, as you rightly say, that President Karzai became more and more infuriated by the ISAF attacks on civilians. And that there came a point when that really it dominated everything. The meetings that were held, the agendas, it was always about ISAF attacks on Afghan civilians. And it infuriated Karzai, and I think it really dominated the discussion. The young staffers that work for Karzai that were working on the National Security Council setup. It dominated their life as well. People were consumed by it. How do you explain as a president to your people that this supposedly friendly force who had arrived to create stability and safety in your country were now appearing to wantonly attack civilians? And it certainly dominated the dialogue and the discussions that happened.
I'm really keen to know about the man himself, the demeanor, I mean, he does come across as a very, I suppose, soft-spoken, a kind of a tribal elder-esque man. From the people who are spoken to, governed the country as an elder of a tribe who'd hold kind of, I don't know, surgeries per se to hear grievances and then let them go, and then get the next batch coming in and hear their grievances. So he was more of a not a modern leader, was he?
Well,
In the mold of what we expect a modern leader to be.
um, he 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 was, yes, he was very mild-mannered and a person that really wanted to understand the Afghan people and to deliver to them what needed to be delivered. They had suffered, as you well know, decades of war and hardship and deprivation, especially under the not just the Taliban, but in the years previous when there had been a civil war in Afghanistan. So these people, Afghan people, were suffering terribly. They needed a leader that would demonstrate that he was listening to them for sure, and 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 was able to demonstrate that he could deliver things like basic services, medicine and schools and education generally, including higher education, lines of communication, jobs, payment on time, budgets down to provincial councils and district councils. But and I can say without a doubt that I think that Karzai wanted to be able to do that. But what an incredibly difficult position for someone to be in. I mean, as fast as we were trying to deliver these basic services to the Afghan people and working with Karzai to do that, I mean, there was a genuine desire to be able to do that and give the Afghan people what they deserved. At the same time, there were members of the Afghan government that were really working against those principles. And this is where the whole question of corruption comes into play. I mean, as a president, how do you keep them on side because they're an important tribal leader, they have influence, and at the same time, you know that they're embezzling huge amounts of money um, that is supposedly to be put to basic services for the Afghan people. How do you balance that? What an extraordinary difficult job this man had. And generally speaking, throughout his time as president, I, my memories of him is someone who had extraordinary grace and graciousness,
Hmm.
and from time to time just became infuriated with the impasses of dealing with corruption of the international community not understanding what he had to deal with. And certainly the military did not help in that respect. The ISAF didn't help in that respect. Trying to understand the extraordinary difficult juggling task that he had. And yeah, I mean, there was probably no greater or more difficult job than Karzai had in those early years between when he was elected. He was the interim president, obviously, to start with,
Yeah.
and then was elected in, what was it, 2009, all the way up to when Ashraf Ghani was elected. But handled it with such grace, commitment, passion, and love of the Afghan people, and was really quite an extraordinary difficult task held by an extraordinary man.
And a private man as well. I mean,
Yes, very private. I mean, people very. We never saw his wife. We knew about her. I knew about her because I lived in the palace. But publicly, we in all the years we did not see his wife at all. We knew nothing about his close family that lived in the Arg Palace with him.
something that people often talked about his commitment to the role of women, for example, and of course he had his own tribal, familial relationship with people, within so his own family accused of mass corruptions and drug dealing, etc., etc. But in terms of that specific issue, because people expected a leader, at least, had he been more open about his own, wife being public, uh, then would that have had an impact on the way, for example, women in the Pashtun belts would have been perceived? I mean, does that make sense to you?
Well, I don't know, Ro. Maybe you could tell me about Afghan culture. I mean, my understanding of it was that it just just wasn't done for a public official to talk about their family and their wives. That's very private business. And I found, working with a lot of Afghan ministers, um, they would never talk specifically about their wife and their family. They would always say, so polite. I mean, incredibly polite. Would always say, "How is your family? How are you? How is your family? How are your grandparents? How is your brothers? How are your sisters?" And then I would be expected to ask them the same back. How is your family? How is your... But they never talked in detail about their wife or their family members.
And
And I
you,
don't know whether this is a cultural thing or whether I never figured out if it was a cultural thing or whether it was just a security issue, actually.
hmm,
Could well have been a security measure that they took.
the Americans, for example, they did not have, I mean, there were so many competing um, objectives when it came to, the way they managed and led the war in Afghanistan from the get-go. I mean, we
Mm.
know how much competition was there between the CIA and the State Department and the Defense Department, particularly Donald Rumsfeld. But that carried on, that multiple objectives that never kind of gelled together carried on to the end. But how was it impacting your work? For example, Americans, they had different sets of objectives which were not really cemented. They were kind of, scattergun approach, changing all the time, not knowing what the end story was going to be.
That famous exit strategy. What's the exit strategy? Yeah. Well, okay, so I just to backtrack a little bit, I when I finished that job with the capacity building at the National Security Council, I went back to Washington
Hmm.
for a while and I worked in the Pentagon
Yeah.
as Afghanistan country director in OSD policy. So I got to see it from the Washington side of things, looking at how Afghan policy for Afghanistan is decided in Washington. And this speaks to your point about disparate goals and objectives amongst the various departments of the United States government and different organizations. And it's really quite extraordinary that our national security advisor, or our national security in Washington, would hold, I think they were monthly meetings where all the different um, organizations in Washington would come together to talk about Afghan policy, to come up with a coherent strategy and policy and decisions on policy. And every ministry, or not ministry, every um, department, uh, Department of State, Department of Justice, Department of Defense, National Security Council, Department of Agriculture, they would all come together with their view of what the policy should be. Come with their particular agenda of their department. And these issues would be discussed around the table in Washington. And people were sharp on their policy. They were strident about their policy. And what I noticed over time was that a coherent policy would never emerge as a good policy. It was just well, let me liken it to an artist's palette. When an artist starts painting, they have a nice palette of clear colors, nice blue, a nice green, a nice clear red, a purple. And once those colors, if you mix all those colors together, you come out with a sludgy brown. And
Yeah.
I used to think at the end of it that the policies for Afghanistan that we were going to send down the line into country were just sludgy brown. There
Yeah.
was nothing really um, uh, really decisive or sharp or anything that would move the mission forward. And that's really what happened over a good period, many years. And of course, you've probably heard this term before, the rotation of internationals, Americans, especially into country, was a year at a time. And so it was 20 years of fighting the war 1 year at a time. And that certainly doesn't speak well for coherence and continuity.
The Americans, as you alluded earlier, that the West were not blessed with good partners on the ground as well. In terms of what I mean, the corruption and the personalities with the immensely dodgy and dangerous backgrounds.
Yeah, I mean, this is one of the things when you asked me to describe my first few days in Kabul, and I talked about driving on that road from Kabul airport to the American base and how excited I was. It wasn't very long. I mean, literally within the first few days, that the buzz on the American base was all about the corruption. And I was there in 2006. Um, the buzz was about Afghan National Police who had been seen, taking Afghan National Police pay, loading it on big pallets, and flying it out of the airport to Dubai or some such place. And this was commonplace. I mean, we would see it all the time, and we would be aghast that it would happen, and nobody would stop them. Um, and and if there was one thing that was the dominant topic of conversation on this American capacity building a base, Sea Sticker, it's called Sea Sticker, in 2006, was this talk of corruption amongst Afghan government officials, including the Afghan National Police. Ministry of Interior, I think, got the highest marks for the most corrupt ministry. And the moan around the green bean, the coffee shop in Sea Sticker was, how are we supposed to do capacity building? How are we supposed to build an Afghan national police that's competent and loyal and honest and doing a good job if their officials and their leaders steal all their pay and don't pay them? It's not surprising that Afghan National Police set up toll booths on the side of the road and extort money from the local farmer. So this was talk in 2006. We were all very, very much aware of it. And whenever we could, we were open about it. We'd send it back in reports back to Washington. Um, Washington was certainly being told about it very, very early on. There was no secret. But Sludgy Brown, I told you about Sludgy Brown. One
Mm.
of the things about Washington is that the reports coming to the field about corruption, what do you do about that? Imagine sitting in Washington and met almost all of the Afghan officials, high-level ministers and leaders. There are reports of corruption, of them embezzling money, international money, by the way. What do you actually do about that? It's a very hard thing to tackle. And there was a certain point by 2009 where the internationals really realized that it was undermining their entire operation and they really had to do something about it. But it was exactly the same time that Dave Petraeus walked into the White House and persuaded a new president, Barack Obama, that he needed to have a surge
Yeah.
and that he needed to increase troop strength to 140,000. And not only that, he had to increase the budget for the international um, effort. And it was just at the time when corruption had reached proportions where we all knew something had to be done. And suddenly we had this president agreeing to huge amounts of money being pumped into Afghanistan without any accountability. I mean, it was a recipe for disaster. And we very quickly saw in 2009, I was back in Afghanistan working for the Department of State at the US Embassy in Kabul. Very quickly began to see the results of this surge, the
In terms of
military
corruption, in terms of
in
money
terms of,
washing through.
yeah, in terms of corruption. Yeah, I mean, it was really, I have sources, civilians, internationals who would go to dinner parties in Kabul and sit around with young Afghan, um, educated elite Afghans who would talk openly about what tactics they had to extort some of that. And I don't think they used the word extort. It was more of a case of, look, the money's just flowing in left, right, and center. It's like someone turned on the spigot of this money coming into the country with nobody accounting for it. How do we get some of that? And it was a free-for-all. And that, I think, as you well know, Ro, I'm sure many on your show have talked about it. It undermined the international effort. It's probably the single thing that undermined that international effort to help build a nation build in Afghanistan.
I suppose most of those, predominantly men, they saw every institution, every position as some sort of, money-making opportunity that's not going to last forever. And hence, when things fell apart, they didn't have any stake in the game to continue fighting, or because they'd already stashed enough outside the country to go and enjoy themselves. I mean, we've spoken about it previously, after the fall, the story is well known, is everybody's talked about accountability, sense of shame that prevailed in the West, uh, political recrimination as well. But one thing that has not been touched is that cohort of Afghan elites who fled the country in disgrace and still are enjoying the money.
Yeah, absolutely right. I remember, one policeman particularly, I think he I think he embezzled 600,000. Um, and I literally watched him. We tracked him leaving the country with the money on a pallet. And then we tracked him all the way, and he ended up outside of Austin in Texas and opened up a Cadillac dealership, and is, I think, probably still running it to this day. Thank you very much, international community. You definitely gave me the seed money for my Cadillac dealership. And there doesn't seem to be, you're absolutely right. There has been no accountability on the Afghan side of those individuals. The Kabul banks scandal,
Yep.
300 million just sort of disappeared. I mean, they really weren't, there was really very little.
Karzai's brother was involved in that, wasn't he?
Yeah, I mean, it's just quite extraordinary. But I have had many years to think about this, and I really have to try to put it in perspective. And I always try to think, what if I had been a young Afghan in Kabul at that time? And I had lived through the years of the Taliban. Maybe I was, I had also been a child during the time of the Civil War. Um, the extraordinary suffering that Afghans um, have experienced doesn't really is very hard to show another country that have experienced such suffering over such a long time. And it puts you very much into survival mode.
Hmm.
And if you're a child and you've seen death around you, you've starvation, oppression, and you suddenly now you're in this world, you're a young adult um, in this world of the internationals bringing in all this money. I mean, with no seemingly very little to stop you being able to figure out how to get some of that for yourself and to create a nest, a nest egg for your family, put that money overseas so that if things go badly wrong, you at least can get your family out. You can protect your family. At the very least you can do when everything around you is a shambles, everything around you is corrupt. At least you can do the right thing and look after your family. And I think that's what a lot of Afghans did. And in many ways, I understand that. It's about, we all survive, try to survive as human beings. Um, and so there are good reasons to do what they did. What I think is shameful, and I don't think has really been properly acknowledged, is the international leadership, the American army generals, the politicians at the time, who who so easily agreed to send huge amounts of money into a country where they didn't understand the culture and didn't understand the impact of putting so much money into a country without proper accountability. It was inevitably going to end badly, and that's what happened, of course.
And that inevitability of ending badly, I mean, when did it dawn to you that this thing is not going to, this thing is unsustainable or it's not going to last?
Well, um, Well, certainly in 2006, when the buzz, the conversation that you couldn't go a day without the international community, people helping to capacity build in Afghanistan without talking about corruption. And you sort of knew that at that point something was going badly wrong. This is in 2006. Um, but we're ever hopeful. You know, we all went in many ways altruistic, idealistic. We all went thinking we can make a difference. You know, if we work really hard, we can try to change that. By 2000 um, 2007, the security situation in Afghanistan began to get noticeably worse.
Yeah.
We used to be able to drive around the country in 2006 in soft-skinned vehicles with, just a couple of bodyguards, literally drive all around the country and we'd be okay. By 2007, the security situation had become a lot worse. By 2011, it was very clear, and I think the White House at that point understood it too, that the mission was not going well at all, and that it was really a case of trying to figure out how to wrap it up in the best way and lock it down and close it down in the best way possible. In 2014, Resolute Support mission started, ISAF mission ended, and I would say by that time, it was very, very clear and obvious in the halls of government in Washington that this mission had to end. It wasn't going in the direction or the way that had been hoped back in the early days, 2001, just after the Bonn conference. So, yeah.
The sense that you've got now, is it of, I don't know, anger or depression?
I'm most sad for the Afghan people. That's my overriding feeling. Afghanistan is an absolutely beautiful country. It's got amazing natural resources. It could be a country of extraordinary success. It could have the most fantastic tourist industry. It could have a great ski resort in Bamiyan. Those 3,500 semi-precious jewels in the Hindu Kush could be, sustainably mined. Its gas fields really has amazing potential. It has its people who diaspora that have come out of Afghanistan are really bright, industrious, creative people. They have all of the ingredients to create an amazing, uh, economically viable, prosperous country. And look at what badly placed international policies, poor leadership, corruption does to a country. My overriding feeling is a great sadness for the Afghan people. I mean, been betrayed in so many ways, and they suffer terribly. They still suffer terribly. Um, and but I will. I just did a talk the other day here locally in Warwick on the future with the Taliban in power. And as counter as intuitive as it may sound, I think you could argue that maybe the best thing at the moment for the Afghan people is the Afghan government is in power and they have taken over running of the country. Because in a country that has experienced so much insecurity, at least with the Taliban, there is an effort to create safety and security. I mean, we all know Maslow's hierarchy of needs. That very bottom rung of the ladder is about creating a safe and secure environment. I mean, that's the absolute basic that people need to begin to grow vegetables, create a bit of a industry at a local level, organic level, and you can build on that. You could argue that safety and security, the Taliban have been able to deliver that. And that's something that's extremely important.
The opponent of that idea would argue, you know, condoning 50% of the population to absolute nothingness. I mean, is that security?
Well, it certainly doesn't bode well for their economy. I mean, if you look at any economy, you want to try to use all of your human resource in your country. By denying 50% an involvement in the economy, yes, you're certainly at a disadvantage. But here's another sort of counterintuitive view on it, Ro. I I tend to think that any country, and this isn't a blanket statement, I mean, there are obviously exceptions that you could find, but generally speaking, whenever you have a country that's doing well economically, women tend to fare better. I mean, it's a gradual process, but as the economy improves, so does women's position and status in that country, so that improves. And so I think it's a bit, you have to be utterly pragmatic about Afghanistan. And if you create at least a secure environment where they can begin to build an economy and it can strengthen, and I'm not talking in 10, 5 to 10 years, I'm talking about generationally.
Yeah.
If they can at least build an economy and begin to build an economy, and the Taliban is able to create local, regional trade ties and begin to build this, it may be that you see a commensurate improvement in the status of women. And I know it's pretty dire at the
Yeah.
moment.
I mean,
I
and
know, I know that.
that ideal pragmatism that you mentioned, does that mean, the international community? I mean, the Russians have done it. They've been the first country to recognize the Taliban. I mean, would you be prepared to say that the international community, especially the West, in the interest of that pragmatism, got to recognize the Taliban now?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I'll go out on a limb and say that. I know the reason the US doesn't engage with the Taliban is mostly because of the issue with women. Um, but I would argue that by carefully engaging with the Taliban, lifting the sanctions and trying to carefully, slowly and deliberately building up trade ties is maybe arguably the best way to help women. But and of course women are always the ones that suffer at home when there isn't enough food, trying to raise children. A poor economy means they can't feed their families and they suffer terribly because of it. And there is a view that we might actually be exacerbating their hardships by not encouraging an improved economy and trade ties with the Taliban.
You'll get bombarded by saying all these things.
Of course I will. Yeah, absolutely. But then please, the first thing I'd say was, well, tell me the solution. What is the solution? If we don't, the best thing I think for women is for us to engage with the Taliban and to quietly do it at first with trade and economic discussions, and then in time, over time, and I'm talking generally generationally, it's not going to happen quickly. This could lead to quiet interventions that generally help women.
No, I mean, would that process for you would start with giving them, the status of recognized government.
Yeah,
Now,
yes.
that's very blunt. Thank you so much. Now let's get to the weird and the wonderful of Afghanistan. So, let's talk about that.
The weird and wonderful of Afghanistan.
Yeah, let's give us snippets, give us stories, give us gossips, give us everything that you've got that you think.
Do you really want me to do that, Ro?
Yeah, absolutely do that. I mean, after
Because the
that,
first one that comes to mind is really quite yeah, it's quite something. But I will, okay, for a bit of fun, I will recount the story, the tale that I like to tell. One of the stories I like to tell about Afghanistan. So, the international community like to travel a lot, and they like to go to district councils out
yes,
in rural Afghanistan, and we'd go in these small groups. We usually fly by helicopter in. And then we'd go out to the district council, and the Afghans are always so hospitable and gracious, and they would feed us.
yes,
And we would sit down in the hall, the shura main hall where they were going to entertain us. We'd sit all around in together, and then the food would be put in the middle, and we'd eat with our hands, eat our food.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
And, and I was felt very humbled because I was almost always the only woman that was included in that group. But nevertheless, I was included, and I felt very honored and humbled to be able to do that. But of course, the problem always came when you needed to go to the bathroom, because there would
Yes.
never, in public spaces and places, there would never be a bathroom for women. It would only be a bathroom for men.
That's
So you
proper
would have,
unisex, that is for you. That's proper unisex.
yeah, that's proper unisex. You're absolutely right.
Somewhere
No,
outside the compound, there's a hut.
but it's really quite, it's quite awkward when you're in a room with all men, the only female, and then you have to ask the little guy in the corner who's looking after us and serving the food, um, if he could help you find the ladies' loo.
Yeah.
So, but of course he through language you're able to be able to get him to do that. And I remember he took me to the back of the building to the men's loo. Now I won't go into the details describing this loo, but let's say it had never been cleaned.
Ooh.
And he said he would wait for me. And so are you wondering where is the story going? And I said, okay, thank you very much. So I went into the stall, which is really just a hole in the ground, of course. And when I came and I noticed that the floor was actually flooded with about an inch of water that was coming out of the hole in the ground and the taps
Yeah.
around. This is really a, a bacteria-rich environment, I would say. And the little old man, bless his heart, he had waited for me as he promised he would. He was going to escort me home. But in the meantime, while he was waiting for me, he decided that he would wash the grapes for the meal. And he was
Oh,
washing them.
I can.
He
Yeah,
was washing them in the inch of water that was on the floor. And as we went back to the hall, he put the grapes on a big plate and
yeah.
took them back and put them in the middle of the table. And I just sat down. I was signaling all of my colleagues, don't eat the grapes. Don't eat the grapes. Well, there was one particular guy, an American colonel, that I
Oh.
just couldn't catch his eye. He was deep in conversation and he ate the grapes. That guy was sick for almost 2 weeks. I mean, he started, in fact, he got almost instantaneously ill, and we had to cut short the dinner and get back on the helicopter. And really, it was a bad scenario, and he was sick for two weeks.
That is a
So there was
weird Afghanistan. So what's the wonderful now?
a wonderful Afghan story.
Yeah, that's a
Oh
weird
my
one we've
gosh,
got, though. The wonderful one.
a wonderful Afghan story. Um, I think this is a wonderful. It makes me almost cry when I think about it because it was just such a touching experience. Um, so I flew to Daikundi,
Yeah,
which is really I would go out on a limb and say it's probably the most remote part of Afghanistan. It's right in the middle of Afghanistan, right in the Hindu Kush. And the people in Daikundi, generally speaking, the main town there, they only can get out of that area through the mountain passes 6 months of the year. So they're snowed in, um, and really sequestered away from the rest of the world. And they very rarely see anyone else. And we flew in a UN helicopter, Russian helicopter, from Bamiyan into Daikundi. I think it was in September, just as the snow was about to fall, so their winter was about to set in. We flew into Daikundi, and the mission was to try to talk to the district council in Daikundi, primarily Hazara. I think they're all Hazara, actually.
yeah, yeah.
And to talk to them about the possibility of setting up a provincial reconstruction team there. These are teams, international teams that
PRTs, as they were called.
PRTs, yeah. And we thought that, it was only fair. The Hazara I mean, the Hazara are just great, hugely industrious, smart, um, open-minded. We thought, wouldn't it be great to have a PRT with a
Awfully
Hazara?
persecuted.
Awfully persecuted. And we felt like this would actually send a message how we felt about the Hazara people, that we wanted to help them. And um, we were met at the helicopter, and we were met by the leader of the district council, and it was a woman. And I had never seen that before. And they were so proud. I mean, this shows the difference between Hazara and Pashtun, of course, that Hazara are much more about women being part of the public space. They understand, I mean, they're certainly traditional, but they understand that women have a role in the public space, that they can make a huge contribution to an economy. They really have quite differing views to the main Pashtun tribe in Afghanistan. And the Hazara, had nominated this woman to be head of their district council. Now, I don't know whether they did it for international benefit to show us that they were advanced and they had a place for women in society. Either way, it didn't matter. There she was in her beautiful traditional costume, no face covering, a head covering, but no face covering at all. She couldn't speak English, but through a translator, she spoke eloquently about the importance of the international community being there, that they badly needed education for the children, both boys and girls. They needed roads and communications with the outside world so that they could expand their economy. I mean, this was a well-informed, um, really in earnest plea for help to the international community. And all of us felt, we were like, why didn't we do this before? This is so important to do it. And at the end of it, she cried because she was imploring us to help her. None of us could make a commitment, of course, because at that point in time, it's a policy decision. It wasn't our decision to be made. But I remember I was the only female with a group of the UN group. And I remember she took me aside and she held my hands and she looked right into my eyes, saying, I can only assume she was saying, please, please help her. And there was this wonderful moment of exchange between a woman that came from this rural land that knew that their best hope of help was from the international community. And I felt like I really should give her something. And I remember having a silver bangle that my son had given me as a gift. And I remember taking it off and giving it to her and saying, I will do whatever I can to help. Of course, that wasn't very much. I could only write a report and advocate, and gave this bangle to her. But it was this wonderful moment, a sort of authentic exchange between somebody who really wanted to do the best for her people.
On that sisterhood solidarity.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Heidi. I really appreciate your time. I really enjoyed it. Um, Great. It's really been great talking to you.
Thanks, Ro. Thanks for letting me share these insights of quite extraordinary 10 years working with Afghans on Afghan issues.
Thank you so much.